purpose of this town hall is to really have you all ask questions, be able to be very interactive, and especially because we have a smaller group here, we can be able to really dive into the nitty gritty if there's anything that arises that's kind of that you don't quite understand. So the goals of this tonight are to first talk about what changed in the law. As the commissioner alluded to, Act 8209 was the law that brought us this payroll variation. The next is, why do we change it? Why do we have to change it from the benefit payment ratio system? Why are we making any of these changes in the first place? And then, how are the new taxes collected? And Director Gary Halyard is going to go into in depth how they're calculated. And again, just to reiterate, you're not going to have to do this as an employer, but we want to be transparent. We want people to be fully understanding of why and how we're doing what we're doing. And then last, of course, we want to have questions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have 3 goals: an overview, how, and then the silver lining at the end is we're going to give you guys some coming now information, which is the new employer portal. So next slide. So the payroll variation methodology, which can be found for the people who are legally inclined in Title 24 VIC 308, has been passed to provide tax reform for the Virgin Islands Unemployment Trust Fund. And we have a few main goals of this. The first is to have a system that is easier to apply. We had a system before, and many of you may be familiar with, was where an employer would have someone who worked for them, and then what would happen is the person would leave for whatever reason, and then the next person they work for would lay them off. And because of that second layoff, the first employer would have benefits charged to their account. So they would have benefits that come back to them, and they would get a ding on their account, and they would say, well, this is not really fair because I didn't lay the person off. So that was the first goal we wanted to make sure that the system was easier to apply. The next, which is very important for the health of the economy, is to have long-term ability to have the system go up and down with the economy. So we wanted to ensure that in the future we would not have to borrow, and that we would have a system in place that would help us in the times of near, but in times of good, we would put more in our system. Next, as the commissioner mentioned, to avoid additional food tax. So in the system of unemployment insurance, the federal government, and I'll go into this in a little bit more depth later, but the federal government allows you to be able to borrow from their system. But if you don't pay it back in a certain amount of time, they have incentives in the form of additional food taxes to get you to pay it back. And so we are putting the system in place so that in the future, we do not have to have a higher food tax rate. Next is to have conformity and compliance with federal law. So the federal system requires that if you use the system a lot, then you pay higher taxes. If you use the system less, then you pay lower taxes. You would expect that. So we want to make sure that it's fair. A flat tax across the board is not fair because it does not have you pay your fair share. And so this system moved from the flat tax to a system that is more what we call equitable. And last, it provides an incentive to keep people on. So we want to, of course, encourage economic growth in our community. And so we want people to keep their employees and not just have them be laid off and bring them back on and have a merry-go-round of unemployment. So this provides an incentive for people to be able to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are 2 forms of unemployment insurance tax. There's the SUTA and then there's the FUTA. The SUTA is the State Unemployment Tax Act, and the SUTA is what we collect from employers, and we take a percentage of the payroll, we call them taxable wages, and we pool that together and provide a basket. So in the event that a person loses their job at no fault of their own, that they're laid off by an employer, that we have a safety net to catch the employee in between jobs. And it's in a cycle of about 2 weeks, which is the idea that if you lose your job today, the next natural payroll cycle in 2 weeks, we would be able to provide some funding to float you or to get you to that next payroll. So that's the overall top tier goal. So that's the SUTA. Now the FUTA is at the federal level. So they have the highest amount of tax is 6%. And what the federal government does is it provides incentives and it provides a form that you could get a credit of 0.54%. So think of it like if you went to a store and you bought a jacket and the jacket was 90% off. That percentage off is considered like the credit. And so the lowest that you could pay is 0.6% of the federal. So you have the state basket and now you have the federal basket. Now the federal basket also works in another way. If there's a reason why the state no longer has enough in its bank and its basket to pay out employees, then they can borrow from the federal, and that's the FUTA. So you have the state basket and you have the federal basket. And essentially right now, all of the UI systems in the United States utilize this model with the state tax and there's a federal tax. Next slide. So a little bit of history, and if anybody has a question, just feel free to put up your hand and I can stop and clarify. But a little bit of history about the unemployment trust fund, that basket that I was talking about for the Virgin Islands, is at one point we were the most solvent in the nation. So compared to our state size, we had $65 million in the black. We were doing very good. We had taken actually, and Director Halley will go into this a little bit more, a little bit too much. We had a very robust trust fund. Next slide. And then the legislature said, you know what, we're going to give a break to employers. We have too much in the fund. Times are hard. We want to give them a little bit back. And so what they did in 2001 is reduce the Virgin Islands Department of Labor's ability to tax employers. They turned the rate off to zero. So they said you no longer have the authority to take taxes in this particular basket. So they're saying this checking account, we're not putting any more funds in this account. And that remained in place until 2012, when they turned it on slightly to 1 and 1.5%. So they said, okay, we're not going to give you zero. We're going to turn it on just a little bit. And then in 2019, we put in place in law this system that we're talking about today, which is a payroll variation. Next slide. Now, of course, life doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so there were a few things that happened in between that time when we turned off our ability to put money in the fund. In 2007, there was a recession, a global recession, especially very hard hit in the United States. So that meant that a lot of people were paying benefits, taking those funds, that basket was having money come out of it. Then in 2012, Hovensa, which is one of the largest private employers, closed their door. At that time, 3,000 people applied for unemployment. So that's more funds coming out of that basket. Then, of course, we all remember 2017, the hurricanes of Maria and Irma. And of course, that had a catastrophic effect. And more people, again, pulled benefits out of the system. And then lastly, of course, in 2020, we suffered the pandemic. And that was the highest amount of benefit claims that we saw, definitely in the territory and again across the country. And at the highest, it was over 27,000 claims. And so a significant amount of money coming out of that fund. And then in 2021, Limetree also shuttered its doors. So again, more benefits being pulled, more money coming out of that bank account. Next slide. So if you continue to pull money out of your bank account without replenishing it, at some point, there's not going to be any money. That's just the way that it works. And so unfortunately, before the pandemic, we had gotten down to over $63 million in the red. So $63 million had been paid on behalf of employees, on behalf of employers, to be able to have them cover those, what we call those benefits. So since we didn't have the money in our local trust fund, that meant we had to borrow from the federal government to be able to get that. And then, of course, when the pandemic hit, it further exacerbated, further put us even more in debt, and it got up to as highest as 96 million, but now we've been able to pay it down slightly, and so we're about 89 million. So the other piece that is important to understand is that we're not just only paying down the debt, but of course, if today we have layoffs in a community, there has to be money to be able to pay out those benefits. And so right now it's about $17 million that we have in our bank account, or what we call the UI Trust Fund, to be able to pay out benefits on behalf of future claimants. Next slide. So Now I'm going to turn a little bit to how the new system of the payroll variation is going to work, how the tax system. I'm going to give you a broad overview, and Director Halyard is going to get into the real nitty-gritty of it. So there's three main components, and this system is going to launch in January of 2024. So what we're really trying to do with these town halls is provide as much information as we can and opportunity to ask questions. So when it does get fully implemented next year, that people are all clear about what's happening. So the three main components are: one, the base contribution rate; two, the fund solvency rate; and three, the tax rate interval assignment. So the base contribution rate is the minimum amount that we're putting into that fund, or the minimum rate to add to that bank account so that we can be able to have a base in the account. The fund solvency rate, which is calculated based on the past 3 years of benefits and the net trust fund balance and the average high cost multiples. I know that's a lot of jargon. We're going to get into that in more detail, but that's going to be the rate that helps to rise and fall with the economy. So that rate's going to change based on how good we're doing and how much of those taxable wages we're taking in. And lastly, the tax rate interval assignment. So part of this process, if you have a payroll that continues to go up, so this is not going to, if you are a smaller employer or a larger employer, it's not based on the amount of the payroll, but just the direction. Is it continuing to go up, or are you continuing to go down? So if you continue to go up, you're going to have a lower tax. And we're going to slot you, similar to brackets. If you have your taxes, we're going to slot you into groups based on your usage. And then from that point, we're going to be able to determine a rate. So we're going to go into more detail, but those are the basic overview. Next slide. So now there's 6 steps to calculate this process. And one more time for the record, you're not going to have to sit there with your calculator and do this to be able to pay the taxes, but we want you to understand exactly where we're coming from. So the first is to calculate the base rate. The second, the solvency rate. The third is the total contribution rate. Then the next is to calculate the payroll variation index. Fifth, to calculate the tax intervals, those brackets that I mentioned. And then lastly, you'll get a final tax rate assignment for each of the employers. So before I turn the mic over to Director Halyard, are there any questions? Sure. The current unemployment rate, that's a great segue. And I'm going to take it right over to Director Halyard because he will know that.
Good evening. I think as of April, it was 3.1 in the VI. So 2.7 in St. Thomas. And, you know, I'm from St. Croix, and I'm forgetting what it is on St. Croix. But not double digit, but that's the rates currently as of April. I think May will be out in about 2 weeks. So good evening again. My name is Gary Halyard, Unemployment Insurance Director. As was mentioned earlier, my slides are going to be the difficult math, maybe fuzzy math, maybe confusing math. You may be more confused after you leave, but we're here to answer questions. During the presentation, I'm going to stop since it's a good crowd, and so you can ask any questions. I go through the 6 steps that were mentioned before. But before I begin, and I didn't have it this time, as employers, one of the things that we want you to be aware of, and we're going to be updating soon, I wish I could have brought it up, I think we just launched, is registering with our state information exchange, data exchange system. And this is a system that allows us to communicate with you as employers to find out certain things as far as earnings from your former employees. We've sort of made it a little more automated. Before, we were just handing out a form. You would sign it. You would call us for a PIN. Now you can go online. It's a video of what it does, all the features that it has. You can fill out that application. It comes into us. It comes into the Chief of Tax, and then you get an email of confirmation that we have received it. But it's an easier way than us trying to track you down, call you on the phone. You know, everyone uses messaging and emails now. And so as time goes out, and you come on our webpage, we would appreciate if you register with us. It'll make your life easier, and in turn ours also, in administrating the program. So I'm going to begin with the calculation of the initial rate. And so basically, as was stated before, every year we're going to sort of do a calculation at the end of the year, usually around the fall. We get ready for the upcoming tax year. We look at 2 quarters of the prior year and 2 quarters of the current year to make our calculation. And that is to come up with the base rate. And the base rate is designed to cover the benefit cost of the system over time. And the benefit cost is basically what is it costing for us to pay unemployment insurance benefits that are out of the trust fund. The base contribution rate is equal to, in our new methodology, the average long-term benefit cost rate divided by total wages over the previous 20 years, and then it's converted to a percentage so that we can calculate it. And the table that you see up here was an example that we ran with the actuaries and our technical folks in the back end as far as if we were to have done this and brought it out, what we're seeing currently in the system. And as you can see, we have 20 years worth of data of wages paid in the territory, the taxable wages, and the taxable wages are based on what's taxable for unemployment insurance, meaning you're not going to tax the entire salary of your employees. It's only a percentage. This year, I think it's at $30,200, up to $30,200 of an individual salary that is taxed. And then, as you can see, the third total benefits are the benefits paid. So the benefit cost ratio, as you can see for the last 20 years, which is the benefits divided by the total wages, and you can see the percentages in the last column for the last 20 years. When you look at the last 20 years, the 20-year average benefit cost rate was about 1.36%. In addition to that, as stated, we also look at the ratio of total wages to taxable wages in the prior tax year. And that's just 1 year we're looking at, so we can determine immediately in the following year what the base rate should be for the system. And the ratio of total wages to taxable wages the prior year was 1.59%. So to get the base rate contribution, we factor in the 20-year average and the ratio of total wages to taxable wages, meaning if you multiply the 1.36% and the 1.59%, you're going to get a 2.16% of taxable wages for a given year. And this is something we're going to do every year. So this is going to change. So as the years go out, the last year or the first year will drop off. And as we continue going through, this is how we're going to calculate the base rate for the system. Any questions?
Obviously, in 2021, the total amount of wages paid throughout the Virgin Islands was not just 1 million.
And it looks like 1 million, but really, and we just showed
like
it's a billion.
Got a whole bunch of zeros.
Yeah, I forgot a whole bunch of zeros to make sure the chart fits on the page.
So we're looking more at
$1 billion,
$1 billion.
And 687 million was taxable, and we paid out about 16 in benefits at the point in time when we ran this calculation. Anybody else? Questions? And I know it's, we're going to be here and we're going to have another town hall or virtual. And so I know it's hard. It's the first time you're seeing it maybe and to digest it, but give us a call. We're here to answer your questions. Next slide. So on top of that base rate, we're also based on what we discussed before as far as the fund going insolvent, the tax rate being 0. One of the other things that we put in place is a trigger mechanism for a fund solvency rate. And this rate is added to the contribution rate based on the solvency of the trust fund for a calendar year using the average high cost multiple measurement. Long word, but average high cost means what was the cost of the benefits, and we put it into a factor or a multiple. And to get that, basically the average high cost, is really a trust fund measure recommended by the Unemployment Compensation Council, Advisory Council, and is used by USDOL to grade every state that has a trust fund as far as the multiple. And in simple terms, it means, for every dollar that we have to pay out, we should really have at least a dollar plus in reserves or in the trust fund or dollars to pay out. And so every year, the system says to do the average high cost multiple, you take the current fund balance divided by total wages over the average high cost rate. So the new law, and this is in law already and has been established, I think it was back in 2019, that's here in this table under item C. That's what's in the law as far as the triggers for the fund solvency contribution rate. And so the new law establishes a range for the fund solvency contribution rates and trigger points to be in effect when the fund balance is above or below a certain target. Various levels of the fund solvency contribution rate will be triggered depending on a yearly measure of the solvency of the trust fund. And under the new law, the target balance or the range set is 0.81 to 1.20, or in dollars and cents, 81 cents to $1.20. And that's what we want to keep so that we don't get ourselves into where we're at now with being 89 million in borrowed funds. USDO recommends that states, as it says, maintain a 1.0 average high cost multiple. And so when we look at the average high cost in this example, the higher years that we had a benefit cost rate that were highest for the last 20 years was in 2020, 2002, and 2003. And when you average those, the 3.46, 2.31, 2.10, you have an average high cost rate of 2.62%. Now, the aggregate reserve ratio, as you can see in this example, is a negative 7.90. And that is because we have total wages of $1 billion paid, but the net trust fund balance, which is part of it, is a negative $86 million at the point in time when we did this calculation. It went up because we had to borrow during the pandemic to pay, because we didn't have enough in the trust fund to pay claims and benefits that were present in the territory. So when you net these two, 2.62 and the negative 7.90, the average high cost multiple is a negative 3.01, or we have negative $3.01 to pay for every dollar that we should be paying in claims. And if you look at the table, if it's less than 0.01, anything less than 0.01, the fund solvency contribution rate is going to be 2%. And that's why the fund solvency rate in this example is 2%. And this is going to change as time goes by. If you notice, when we get to, I would say at least the 81 cents to $1.20, it goes zero. It zeroes out. When it's $1.21 and more, you sort of get some relief. So if you netted the 2.16 that I showed in the base rate, and we had $1.20 or more, you would net those two to come up with the base contribution rate for the year. Questions?
So this is to help get SUTA back to where it needs to be in the black instead of in the red.
Correct. Yes. And this is sort of the mechanism to always keep it, so that we don't have to change the law. It's sort of, as was explained before, as payrolls rise in the territory and the economy does is great, it's going to slightly go up, and then soon I'm going to get into the experience rating, and the experience rating is sort of spreading the risk the insurance risks, because you have some employers that use the system more than others. Some employers stay steady for many years, increase their payroll, give raises. Others do the opposite, steady declining, and so they're going to fall, and you're going to see as we get into the tax rate groups how this happens. However, our expectation is once we pay off this loan and things get better, all employers are going to be in a medium range, and the burden is not going to be as bad as it is now. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, next slide. So that is the total contribution rate, and so that's like the floor every year. This also includes, that wasn't mentioned before, new employers. And new employers are folks or businesses that are recently established, and when you establish your tax liabilities, the first day you start to pay employees' wages. And so you have 3 years as a new employer until you're considered to have some experience. And so if you're a new employer and this were the tax rate or the total contribution rate, you would pay 4.16% up to that $30,200 for each employee that is, at your establishment. So this is where we're going to get into the experience rating, and was really going to bring us back into federal compliance as far as why we had to change the law, why we had to implement this, and seeing that this was one of the best ways of not having to always go back to the Senate, ask for change, go through legislation, go through restructuring everything else. And so the payroll variation index under UI tax reform, tax rates will be assigned based on the employer's ranking among all employers. So this is a pooled system. So we're going to pool employers into a system and rank you based on your payroll and have you in different intervals. Employers are ranked from the highest to the lowest payroll variation index. Employers are then assigned in order to assign a tax rate, and they're assigned to a tax rate interval group. There are 14 of these. And with varying proportion of taxable wages placed into each interval. Group 14 would have 0.01% of taxable wages, meaning if you fell, or your company fell in group number 14, you represented 0.01% of all the taxable wages. Go back to that $1 billion that we saw. That's what you would represent in the pool if you were to be placed in group 14. If you were to be placed in group number 1, you would represent 2%, and so forth for all the 14 groups. The percentage of taxable wages, the largest group is going to be group number 5. And group number 5 gets right back into that base contribution rate. So that's where we that's the median at 40%. And the proportion of taxable wages would be symmetric above and below this group, except for groups 8 to 14. So groups 8 to 14 are where you're sort of going to have a slightly higher rate based on the year and based on what we calculate and based on your percentage, because as we said, it was sort of designed to keep the economy steady, keep it growing, and keep, as you increase, wages increase, persons get promotions, you should see it. And if you keep steadily declining, though, that's where it gets burdensome. And as I said, as you're steadily declining, your employees are more than likely, possibly using the trust fund and pulling dollars out of the trust fund versus other employers are staying steady, doing well, and paying in. And so this is where USDOL and ourselves, I think Alaska is the other state that has this. Other states have a different, but this is where we figured you would start to sort of keep it going and get some equity for all employers. Next slide. So the tax interval assigning rate factor, employer experience, the minimum tax rate for any group would be 0.4%. So even despite the calculation and what happens and what wages we take in, because this is math, because it possibly could, no one will go below 0.4%. And the maximum tax rate, and you're going to see in some examples of why, will not go above 5.4%. So that's the cap. The tax rate factors simply add or subtract to a percentage of the total contribution rate. And so this is just showing the group intervals, the cumulative taxable wages from at least 0 to but less than 2%. Your tax rate factor is negative 1.6 and so forth. This is also going to change based on the wages collected, or the taxable total wages that is paid in the territory every year. And that's going to change. It's not going to be the same every year. Any questions? Sure.
How are the companies determine which interval?
Well, the companies are not going to determine it. The system is going to determine it based on your percentage of total taxable wages, of total wages in the territory.
So you're assigning it based on
the system is assigning. Can you go back to the previous slide? So let's say based on the wages you've paid, you represent 0.50% for the entire pool, meaning all the employers. Let's for example's sake, these are all the employees in the Virgin Islands. If you fall in that group 11, you're going to represent, and the dollars you've paid to your employees is going to represent 0.50%, and you'll be assigned to that tax group.
Okay, so I understand that. So does that mean the evaluation is done every year? Because as companies come on, come off,
Yes.
payrolls change, etc.?
Yes, every year, just like now, even in the old process, we come up with a new tax rate every year. And that has to be based on looking at what wages are paid. This is a payroll tax. So it's determined on what payroll is in there. It's a percentage of the payroll. Like I said, it's not the entire payroll of an individual. It's just a percentage. And it's the average wage that we see, or average salary that is paid for a given year within the territory.
Thank you.
Sure. Next slide. All right. So the employer tax rate and the tax rate for each group is calculated each year by adding the tax rate factor, which you see in the first column, the negative 1.6. And then you're going to add that to the total contribution rate, as you see in our examples. Like we said, group number 5 is sort of that median point. And if you notice their tax rate factor is 0%. So if you fell or you're assigned to group interval 5, your rate would have been 4.16. For the example of group 11, your rate is going to be 5.4. Now, if you add these two, starting with group 8, and you go across and you add, give the example at the bottom, 3.60% plus 4.16 is not 5.4%. Right? It's higher, right? If you add the two. But remember, we have a cap, 5.4%. So you're not going to go over that. So that's sort of the safe harbor, or so that we don't sort of hit too hard, because like I said, in the raw math, if you keep doing that and wages, the rates are just going to keep climbing. So that's why, and it's by federal law. Federal law is 5.4%, so you're capped at 5.4%. And, I think, was it Arizona is at 20% now? 21? Yeah, 21. So we have a cap in there at 5.4%. Questions? No? Okay. One slide. So this is just sort of wrapping, what I've presented so far of the two, the total contribution rate, the base contribution, looking at it over 20 years, seeing what we need, the fund solvency contribution rate, and that is really right now, when we look at it, because we've had the loan, that's the heavy lift right now. that 2%. And that is because we said we've had this loan outstanding since around, I think the first borrowing started back in 2009. We sort of got a little better, but then that was the recession, but then 2 storms. We had to go back and borrow, and then the pandemic, our biggest period, I think, or historical of claims in the territory. We had to borrow about approximately 32 million to cover that pandemic period. Currently, as you saw, the fund has about 17 million to pay future claims. Now, we can't take that money and pay down on the loan, but that's for future claims. And as we grow it, like we said, this mechanism is sort of designed so that we take just enough and put it, and we don't take out too much, because previously when we had, and the fund was so solvent, we had, I think, for every claim we had dollar, we had $3.20 something or more cents in reserves. And that was just a lot, a little more. And if you go back to what was recommended, $1.21 to 81 cents is really just what you need. Meaning for every dollar you pay out, you should at least have $1.21 to 81 cents in your reserve.
The question is, based on this new methodology, how long do you think it will take for us to become solvent?
Well, how it's going to take, that's dependent. And why I say it's going to take maybe 10 to 15 years. And why I say that is you're paying back, employers are paying back the loan by the FUTA that you're paying.
Which we get hit the credit reduction
Correct.
every year, which is additional 0.3%.
So, right, as you saw in the slides way back up here.
Yes.
6% FUTA tax credit, 5.4, you have an effective rate of 0.6. When your rate it's reduced down to, and I think right now we're trying to request that it doesn't go to 3.9. So every year we have to write the Secretary of Labor, the governor has to write the Secretary of Labor and ask that the Virgin Islands doesn't get an add-on. And this add-on feature is a disincentive to state areas to say, hey, you've borrowed this trust fund money, you need to pay it back, and we're not going to just let you pay it at a static percentage, but we're going to start taking away that tax credit.
So does any of that tax credit that we're paying additional go towards what was borrowed?
Yes, that's how you're paying it back. And so we're reducing it about, I'd say about 5.96 million each year. So let's give an example. If we were to maybe double and we had more employers that come in and are paying in an economy, it will reduce fast. But when I looked at it and I did a quick calculation, I would say about 10 to 15 years. I'm hoping less. And then on top of that, the VI government has to pay approximately 1.3, 1.5 in interest every September. So in June, July, August, we're getting ready to pay our interest on top of that. So just as September comes, it's 89 now. It's going to go back by up $1 million again. And then come January when you pay in your FUTA, and that's why we say it's important to pay in your FUTA, because one of the things with the system is when you don't pay us, every December, the IRS, or January, the IRS asks us for a file based on what you filed to do a comparison. So when they don't see you paying wages to us, they know. And that's why some of you may be familiar with asking for a 940 certification. And it's a check and balance in the system. We send a file to the IRS, and we report what you have paid for a tax year. So we encourage you and encourage all you, the other employers that are out there, pay us, keep your record straight, make sure it's the same, make sure we get the FUTA paid in, and that will help reduce the burden. I know it's burdensome for many small businesses, but this is where we're at.
So what happens to that $25 per employee per year that we were paying for a while?
That has been repealed by the legislature. So the last year, some people still owe us for prior years, but the last year was tax year 2019.
Okay, all right, that makes sense.
2020 fourth quarter. Sorry, 2020 fourth quarter. Because you're right, the tax law was supposed to be in effect for the next tax year. Yes, thank you.
Revised Act you talk about, is it available on the Viral's website?
So good evening again. Yes, it is available on the website, and it's also, if you were to go to the legislature's website and look up Act 8209, you'd be able to see it there as well, because it is law, is currently the law of the land.
Yeah. And we had to ask for forbearance because of the pandemic. We had to shift gears to pay out. Like I said, we got maybe 26,000 claims of persons, during the pandemic for PUA and all the programs that came out. And so we had to ask for a little time because we have to program our systems, get everything in place. That's what we've been doing for the last year. And as the assistant commissioner is now going to do, we have where we're going to make it a little easier. Instead of filling out the paper and coming down the road and stamping and everything else, we're going to start moving it online. We did have a portal in the past. We had some issues after the hurricane. We had technicians and a USDOL information technology group come in, and so we've started a redesign. So we're going to be hopefully the end of this month into early next month in-house testing to test it, and then we're going to move forward. It's going to be initially for those that are third party that have a lot. I know we may still have to keep the old way of sending it to us, but we do have that in mind. And the reason why was the developers said so that we don't have the crash, the site crash because, someone bringing in 400 or 1,000 employees and trying to load it up on our site, it could crash it. And so they have to come up and design another mechanism for heavy batch processing and loading. And we do have that on our radar as our next quick, fast upgrade so that all employers are going to do it. And then the other thing is you're going to be able to, and you'll see, I won't spoil the surprise.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Director Halyard. So one other thing I wanted to mention before we get into, so you had the appetizer with the law, you had the main course with the calculations, and now we're getting into the dessert, which is going to be the employer portal. However, before we get there, one thing to mention that I think the lady in the back of the green talked about the extra add-on, that BCR add-on. So the Department of Labor has been able to successfully, for the last few years, request to the U.S. Department of Labor to waive the continual add-on. Now, of course, whenever you have a loan in the system by federal law, they impose a penalty. They have an incentive for you to be able to pay it back. So we have had a higher increase in, say, other states if you were to look at our numbers. But because we have been working on this and doing certain other things in the law, it allowed us to be able to accept that waiver from them. So we're doing that again this year. We're going to write to the Secretary of Labor to ask for that waiver so it doesn't go up to that 3.9%. So, as Director Holly alluded to, we're going to have an online workforce. So instead of having to scroll down with the staff, you're able to do everything you do, you're able to do in person. So it's going to be similar to any other portal, like if you're going to log into Amazon or some other place. It is going to be very user friendly, and you're going to be able to put in your information, log in as a registered user. And then when we register, one of the things that we learned as a part of this process is that when there's money, people try to report it, not always be effective. We wanted to make sure that the registration process was conducive on fraud in the system. So you're going to be able to register, and then you're going to be able to screenplay. And it's going to happen when you are using it. So here's some of the screen questions. They're basically your packet, so those kind of hard to see on the screen. But basically questions that only you would know. And as Director Halyard mentioned, for the third party administrators, for the future, we're going to have a batch process. If the third party wants to put in all 400 one by one, they could do that. But for right now, we really wanted to make sure that the smaller employers and the employers information in and to be able to see their account. Next slide. So, how is it going to look? You're going to be able to see it by quarters. So that's the way that our system works, is that each quarter you give us your contributions and you pull that information to determine taxable wages and the benefits. And so similar, you're going to be able to put in this information online. Now the beauty of this is that instead of having to fill out the form all over from scratch every month, once you put it in the beginning, this first time, the employee will be there for the next month. So if the wages go up or the wages go down, you'll be able to. Technical difficulties. Can you hear me now? All right. So essentially, we'll be able to have you go quarter by quarter and have the information in. So you won't have to reinvent the wheel every single quarter, but this system, you'll be able to see at a glance the quarter's information from the past. Now, if there's an error or a change, for now, we're still going to come into the office to make that change. But for as it is right here, you'll still be able to file your contributions online. And on the side, it talks about exactly, you're going to see the third quarter, second quarter, it's all going to be listed. And of course, you'll be able to update your phone number, your email address. One of the ways that we're going to be communicating to employers going forward is more electronically. So keeping a valid and up-to-date email is going to be very important for this process. Next slide. Okay, so one of the other pieces that we want to highlight is that, as I mentioned, you're going to be able to put in the information for your employees. So social security number, first name, last name, the wages that were paid, because as we mentioned, you're only being taxed on a percentage of the wages. So then this will develop the taxable wages, the job title, and that's important for us because one, it helps us to calculate benefits, but two, we cross-check that information in other areas of the department if there's a problem. So it's very important for you to put down the job title, the rate of pay, the hours. And the reason why we ask the citizenship question is because unemployment benefits are only allowed to be given to people who are legally able to work in the territory. So if they're a person who has a green card or some other mechanism, a work permit, those are the people who can pay benefits on. So that's why we ask that citizenship question. And then there's also gender, age, and ethnicity. Those are optional questions, but they help us to develop better programming in other areas, so we ask that you fill those out. Oh, I'm sorry. Question? Yes, ma'am. So sorry.
Will there be drop-down lists for job title, citizenship, sex, ethnicity? Will those all have drop-down?
Yes.
Your choice on, say, job titles?
Well, the job titles, we're going to have you write in for job titles, but all the rest of those will have drop down. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to make sure somebody will call somebody administrative assistant here, a secretary there, so you'll put in the job title, but all the rest of them will have drop downs.
Now, my next question is this. I've completed quarter one, and I go into complete quarter two. Will it automatically know, once I put in the wages paid, what the taxable wages are? It will have recalculated from the prior one, so that if in the, say in the first quarter, I do 90%, they are 90% of their way to the cap, will it actually calculate that for you, or do you have to calculate it?
It will calculate it for you. No part of this process you're going to have to do any math. The system is going to do the math for you, and from there you're going to be able to get your rate. He didn't see. He's trying to get back the mic. Okay. So next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So in this field, it shows, in this particular slide, it talks about how you can update the different fields. So you'll be able to have the drop down for the hours, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, the citizenship status, the gender, as well as ethnicity. And all will be something that you can just be able to drop down and choose which one works best for your business and your employee. Next slide. Yes. Sorry. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
I have one other question. Can an employer have more than one user?
Yes. So in this slide, it's going to talk about, basically you're going to do a review. So this, at the end of you inputting the information, you'll have the taxable rate, the total wages, and the total information due. So all that information you'll be able to look through before you hit submit. Next slide. So I'm sure this brings many people great joy to be able to pay online. So we'll be able to put the information in on 2 different methods. We'll be able to use credit cards or ACH online instead of having to come down and write a check and doing that. So you'll be able to actually do this online. Next slide. So once you are able to put in your information, again, we want you to be able to verify that everything is exactly correct before you hit the last button. Last slide. And then you'll get a confirmation. And so if you need this for any other purpose, it's going to be there for you to be able to print out, but you'll also get something emailed to you that verifies that you have paid. And that concludes the dessert portion of the presentation. Any questions? Sure, go ahead. 1 second. He's going to bring you the mic. So this part of the system, the portal is in the testing phase right now. So we're working on it. And so we're doing the development. So by the end of the year, everything will be together. So we've been working on it for a year, but these things actually take longer than we would like, but we've been working on it for quite some time. So by the end of the year, you'll be able to do this.
When will we know what group we're in?
Q1.
Oh, in Q1 we'll know.
Yeah, January 2024, we'll have both the portal portion and as well as the full implementation out from the back end system in the first quarter of 2024. Sure.
The tax rate for each employer, is that something we need to put in, or does that automatically go in? It's put in by the system.
It's going to be automatically put in the system.
So I hope we've been able to bring some clarity. And again, we're all in this together. We had to borrow on behalf of the employers. And so every year when there is a balance, there's a balance on the loan in January, we are assessed fees. And so as Director Halyard mentioned, that FUTA, the employers pay the principal and the government pays. It's been as high as 1.7 million in my tenure in September. So the only way that we're going to be able to ensure that we're not there again is by making sure that we implement this payroll variation system. What's also good is that we're on the cutting edge. The only other state that has anything close to this is Alaska. The United States Department of Labor is trying to be able to move more states to this type of method, as most states are still on the benefits reserve system. And so, it's very important that we all take a good look in terms of what's happening when you start getting the ranking within your individual payrolls, because it's important who uses the system more. And I don't know, anybody here seasonal employer? So there's some seasonal employers that if you use the system more, the tax rate is going to be higher. And so this is designed because we have to make sure that there's what you call an experience rating in the system, and that gets us into compliance with federal law. So I want to take the opportunity to thank you for your time, for coming. Great. Yes, question?
I do have a question. My name's Forrest Coit Anderson. I am originally from Texas. I would like to thank Vital and the commissioner for arranging this town hall event. I have one question. I would like to ask as follows. I would like to know how the Department of Labor /commissioner of labor can assist an employee in getting back wages paid to the employee in a timely manner.
Our division, our labor relations, is very key in terms of settling those disputes, as well as wrongful discharge, as well as wage claims. So this would be considered a wage claim. And so the technicalities with that, again, both sides have to be able to be investigated and a determination made.
I've had positions posted on Views for an extremely long period of time. I'm sure like other companies have. And we see all of these job fairs that happen. Now our business is based on tourism. So the job fairs that happen on Wednesday, which is our biggest ship day, don't really help us out at all. Who would be the person or the people to talk to about possibly having a job fair on another time that might benefit those of us in the hospitality industry that can't make a Wednesday?
It would be Director Charlene Hodge, our Director of Workforce Development Services. But even one better, we can do one specifically designed for you at your time as well. So we've done that for other companies in the past, other industries in the past. Because again, we would love to, what we like to say, we like to flip the coin from unemployment to workforce development and try to make sure that everybody that can get a job does, that makes sure that helps this process tremendously. And so that's one of the reasons why you hear me, again, very unpopular, excuse me, in the community, thinking and proposing that we change from 26 weeks of unemployment benefits, reduce it to 13 weeks. And part of the reason is to try to get more individuals in the workforce that can. It helps to do some reduction on this system as well. It's not going to be very popular, but I think it's the right time. I think it's the right time to do it, and it will help us with our participation rate. We looked at it. It's about 49% is our participation rate, and that includes everybody from children to our elders. So if we're at 49%, and when you start looking at the individuals that are eligible to work, and then Director Halyard, from his role in Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing in terms of employers in terms of our workforce, the numbers.
Well, I guess with the numbers, I think what we're seeing is ever since we would say the hurricanes, our private sector employment has just been down. We have really not yet really recovered to numbers that were once up in the 30s just before the recession. We've been averaging roughly about 24,000 in the private sector, and the rest is made up with government, the semi-autonomous, the university, and all the other areas. So, as we said, as we grow the economy, and that's what we need, people working, and that's going to sort of expand the economy and have the dollar cycle in it.
Thank you. So there are about 39,000 or so in the workforce right now. You're looking at 24,000 private sector. It definitely needs to be higher.
Yes, I have a question. As you mentioned, workforce development. I saw earlier today in a bus stop, a poster where you have free courses in construction, and that sort of thing. So I wanted to know, I know the governor of the USVI encourages workforce development. Does that include migrants? Let's say, for example, could possibly enlist to these free construction courses. What's your stance, Vital stance on that?
I'll say this. You're talking about the Skills for Today program, and within the Skills for Today, we get funds from the Community Development Block Grant. We wrote for a $10 million grant. We received it. It was only to spend $10 million in 2 years. We're at the end of that right now. So pretty much we have within our cohorts, we're expected to train 640 individuals, totally with 400 in the construction area. We have to date right now, there's about, as of March, the numbers was about 373 individuals that were trained in construction, and that includes core based on the NCCR standards, and then we had individuals that go into plumbing, electrical, carpentry, and masonry. But the masonry numbers are very low, and we also were able to add welding and pipe fitting. So our welding cohorts are really taking off on St. Croix. We would really love for them to take off in the St. Thomas, St. John district as well. But right now we're pretty much closing out that program, and we're looking for additional funding to be able to develop what we call Skills for Today 2.0. We have within the Department of Labor, we have what we call a foreign labor certification program. And within that program, we work in tandem with immigration. And so it would tie into the vacancies would have to be posted in views for X amount of period of time, and you would have to go through that process for us to be able to say we're going to enter you into any of those federally funded programs. Again, I want to thank you for your time, and we're here to solve, and definitely I want to make sure I thank Assistant Commissioner and Legal Counsel, Ms. Nisha Christian Hendrickson, and Director Gary Halyard, because again, they've been spending a lot of time, a lot of hours in making sure that we can not only move forward with this implementation, but to be able to break it down so that we can all understand, especially what's happening behind the scenes. So it's very important that we are very transparent so that you know all the calculations are, that's what the system is going to do. We want to make sure that if there's any questions or anything that you might think of, because again, we aim that when we come back out, we want to be able to update you on where we are and give as much updated information, because January 1st, 2024 is right around the corner. So again, thank you very much.